right, today's lecture is still on Unit 7. Now, this is the part of Unit 7 where we're going to talk about sexual motivation, belongingness, and achievement motivation. So this is a topic that can be a little bit uncomfortable. So if at any point you are uncomfortable, just let me know. You can private message me, or you could email me afterwards. Or if you're like, yeah, I really don't want to learn this in class, I'd rather read it in my book, that's fine. Alabama is an abstinence only state, so legally I can't teach you about contraceptives or how it works or how to access them, but we are going to talk about how there's cultural and social psych topics that go with that. So everything that we're going to cover in this lecture is a part of the AP curriculum. Okay, but if you would rather just read it in the Unit 7 chapters rather than discuss it in class, I understand that. No harm, no foul. Okay, who's that? I think I already got Naya. All right, so let's just dropped her. Alrighty, so we're gonna go ahead and begin. Now, y'all remember that one of the first theories of motivation that we covered was drive reduction theory. This is where your body is trying to maintain homeostasis. When you're out of homeostasis, then that builds tension, and your behavior is supposed to, oh wait, I think that's Jennifer that I saw come in. Okay, your behavior is, there we go, is supposed to get you back into homeostasis. So we talked about how hunger is a drive and thirst is a drive, and so that leads you to the behavior of eating and drinking. There is a sex drive, but if you don't go without food or water for an extended period of time, then you die to death. Okay, no one's ever died from not having sex. Okay, so the difference here is you need to eat and to drink to live, but the sexual drive is more so of evolutionary benefit, because in evolution, you're supposed to pass down your genes so they could be preserved, and you have change in the species over that. So this is more of a drive that deals with preserving the species rather than preserving you as an individual. Yes, Nathan, I have seen the show 1,000 Ways to Die. If y'all remember that show, it may be before your, yeah, and it's like, yeah, no, it seems like every episode there's something related to this topic that we're discussing. Okay, but the attachment motivation that we get with our social connections to other people isn't always based in sexual motivation. Love can be completely separate from the sex drive. For instance, with attachment, the feelings of love that we have for other people, there are hormones connected with that, like increased levels of oxytocin and vasopressin. These are the hormones that are released in a mother after she gives birth and has that skin-to-skin contact with the baby. Okay, so it doesn't always have to relate to sexual attachment to someone, but it can also relate to friendships or family ties as well. Now, specifically with the sexual desire, okay, that's connected to specific hormones that all humans possess regardless of their sex. Okay, so androgens and estrogens. Those are hormones that regulate sexual behavior, and they are found in both genders. Okay, they stem from the gonads. Gonads are the scientific term for testicles and ovaries. Okay, so if you are biologically determined to be a male or a female at birth, these are the gonads that you have. And this is where the reproductive cells are housed. So sperm comes from the testicles and eggs come from the ovaries. They fertilize together to create a zygote, which is one of your vocabulary terms for Unit 6. So that fertilized egg implants into the uterine lining in mammals. With reptiles and platypi, they lay eggs. And from that zygote comes a continuation of the species. Okay, so with this sexual motivation, It has a higher evolutionary purpose of continuing the species. And so there is a biological aspect to that. Are we good so far? So how did sex come to be studied? Well, there are some figures and leaders in psychology that didn't want to study just behavior and operant conditioning and, salivation of dogs. They wanted to take a topic that was at the time considered fairly taboo. One of those leaders in psychology was Alfred Kinsey. Like Freud, he is considered the father of these types of studies. So Freud was one of the fathers of psychoanalysis and modern day therapy. Titchener was the founder of, Wilhelm Wundt was the founder of psychology as a whole, as a science. And Alfred Kinsey is the father of the study of human sexuality. Okay, now he didn't conduct experimental methods, so this isn't causation. Instead, he gathered his information on this topic through case studies and surveys, interviewing over 5,000 men and women about their sexual practices and whether or not they engaged in premarital sex, as well as their sexual orientation preferences. From this study came the Kinsey reports. Within the Kinsey reports, there was the creation of a Kinsey scale. Okay, and this detailed that sexuality was a spectrum. There was a continuum of sexuality. It wasn't that people tend to be 100% heterosexual or 100% homosexual, but rather that there is a spectrum therein. So if you were a 1 on the spectrum, then maybe you're completely heterosexual. If you're a 10 on the spectrum, then you're completely homosexual. And then most people are going to fall somewhere between 1 and 10, with 5 being closer to the idea of bisexuality. Okay, so this was groundbreaking because the assumption had been that you can only be 100% one or the other, and there wasn't a spectrum in the middle. So he expanded the understanding of sexual orientation. He also addressed cultural understandings of sexuality and cultural myths that had been perpetuated on this topic because it wasn't something that was commonly discussed. He is doing these surveys in the 1940s. Now, the cultural zeitgeist at the time, when it came to sexual activity, was that it was supposed to be between a man and a woman, and that it was supposed to be within marriage. Okay, premarital sex was considered a negative, and children out of wedlock was considered culturally negative. But what he found in the studies, based on his interviews of over 10,000 people, was that there is a lot of variation in the feedback that he got. Okay, there is an idea of what are normal sexual practices, like waiting till marriage or only having children for the purpose of reproduction. And he found that actually that wasn't where the majority of the people he interviewed fell on that spectrum. And that amongst the people that he interviewed, premarital sex was actually commonplace. Okay, now the issue with this is that it's surveys and specific case studies. If it's a survey, then you're self-reporting and you can lie on a survey, or the wording can be framed in such a way that you're leaning toward one answer or the other. Okay. Also, the people that you attract for a survey, that could skew the information that you receive. This is not scientific method. This is not causation. Okay. It's more so dealing with correlation. Right? If you go up to somebody and say, I want to do a study on human sexuality, can you fill out the survey? Okay, there may be some people who are like, no, absolutely not. And there may be some people that are like, let's go. Okay, so if you have a self-reporting group, all right, who are like, yeah, I definitely want to participate in this study. Okay, they might be a part of the population that does have those wide variations, whereas people who fall more within the culturally quote unquote normal sexual practices might be less inclined to take that survey. Okay, so there are some flaws in that. Okay, just like there are flaws in Freud's ideas about psychoanalysis, but does that make it any less important? No. Okay, it opens the door and it sets a foundation for further studying those things. In addition to Kinsey, Masters and Johnson, they were two psychologists who specifically studied sexual motivation in humans. Now, lots of drama in this story. Masters was the original leader in this study, and he had hired Johnson, a single mother, to be one of his office staff. Well, he ends up, cheating on his wife with Johnson and then leaving his wife to be with Johnson, and she becomes a critical part of these studies. Okay, so just a little bit of interesting drama background there. The studies that they performed became the most influential studies in human sexuality, okay, thus leading to further scientific study of sexual behavior, including in a lab setting. That's in fact how they studied this themselves, is that they created a lab and they had people come in and they started testing. Yeah, I know. They started testing these responses. Okay, their ideas and the things that this led to resulted in medical treatment as well for sexual dysfunction. So whether that is a part of therapy treatment for couples, for instance, or sexual hangups that people were having. So there was a medical scientific benefit to that as well. In addition, culturally, they exposed many sexual myths, okay, because it's very easy for misinformation to get spread if people don't talk about the topic, and so they don't know what they're talking about it. I mean, like, y'all have all been to middle school, okay? You've probably heard a lot of myths along the way, okay? One of the things that they studied experimentally in a lab was the specific sexual response cycle. Okay, so what are the typical sexual reactions of humans? So they did gather some volunteers in the 1960s, okay, hippie generation, and they identified there are 4 stages to sexual response. There's the excitement stage, which leads to vasocongestion. Vasocongestion is the swelling of genital tissues with blood. Okay, that happens to men as well as women, but we're most likely associating it with penile erections. Okay, but overall, the biological responses to this cycle are going to be similar. Okay, so you enter into the excitement stage, there's swelling of the genital muscles with blood. Then the plateau stage, which leads to myotonia, which is muscle tension, so muscles tensing up. The orgasm stage, which also has its share of muscle tension, and then the resolution stage, which is called the refractory period. Now, y'all may have remembered defining this for Unit 3, the unit that we did on neurons. When neurons fire, when synapses fire, okay, there is a specific refractory period where a neuron has to rest before it can fire again. Kind of like when you flush your toilet. Okay, you have to wait for the tank to fill back up before you can flush the toilet again. Okay, same thing happens with humans in this refractory period. Okay, overall, the biological responses between the genders are the same for all 4 of these stages. The difference is in the refractory period. They found that there is a distinct difference between the female refractory period and the male refractory period. Okay, for instance, men, their refractory period could last anywhere as short as a few minutes before they can enter into the response cycle again, to a full 24 hours before they're able to enter into the response cycle again. Women, it's considerably shorter. The refractory period can last anywhere from seconds to a few minutes before they can go back into that response cycle. Okay, so this just shows the importance of not basing all medical knowledge or scientific knowledge on a male-centric view, okay, because you can't just treat women as basically men but with more hormones, just like you can't treat children as basically adult men, just smaller. Okay, there's going to be distinct differences there. So this is also significant in that it not only studied sexuality, but it also moved beyond the male-centric view of science. Okay, so what controls this cycle? Well, biologically, in terms of evolution, all animals, people in the animal kingdom, have a period of time when they are reproductively viable. Okay, so when reproduction happens and can result in a zygote, it can result in offspring. Okay, now certain hormones are responsible in that. Okay, in mammals, those hormones can put animals into heat. Okay, so this is the period of sexual fertility where their sex drive increases. If any of y'all have ever had a pet and you haven't had them fixed quite in time and they end up sneaking out of the house, okay, and getting pregnant or getting someone else pregnant. Okay, that's what it's talking about. That is the specific time in which their sexual activity increases because their body is telling them reproduce, make a baby. Okay, now humans are unique in the animal kingdom because they don't simply engage in sexual activity purely for reproduction, but there is a biological factor in sexual motivation that relates to hormones. Okay, female women become sexually receptive when the hormone estrogen is in higher levels. This is something that's going to be higher in women. Okay. Does that mean that men don't have estrogen? No, men do. Okay. But it's naturally higher in women. And that level of estrogen peaks during ovulation when an egg is released from the female gonads, the ovaries. Okay, so that egg is ready to be fertilized, and estrogen is sending a message to the brain saying, basically, let's reproduce. Testosterone is in higher levels in men, but it's also present in women, and it has an effect of increasing the sex drive. And so when you hit the age of puberty, that's when these hormone levels tend to be very, very high because biologically, your body is saying, I can continue the genetic line. Now, culturally, socially, we don't adhere to that. Okay, just because you hit puberty at 15 does not mean, okay, let's get married and start a family. But remember, even in his historical context, men tend to marry much older in middle age once they had gotten landed and gotten their finances in order. Women tended to be married off very close to their menarche, to the onset of puberty, okay, because of those hormones making them viable for reproduction. Now, what is sending these hormones through our body? That would be the hypothalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, which is the master gland. Okay, it doesn't just control sex hormones like estrogen and androgen and testosterone. It also controls growth hormones. Okay, but this is where we get the regulation of puberty and our reproductive cycles. Are we good so far? All right. So let's break the awkwardness by doing an FRQ. Okay, now these three terms you're probably familiar with because we've covered them. The one that you're probably not familiar with is the self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're going to go through these one by one, giving definitions and then applying them to this situation. So Ardrey Kell is proposing moving to a system in which grades are no longer given or used to evaluate student progress. Define each of the following concepts and state how each might either positively or negatively change student behavior under such a system. So somebody define extrinsic motivation for me.
Extrinsic motivation is motivation that's like you're not born with it, but like you have it based on outside circumstances like money.
Exactly right. It's the opposite of intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is you do something because you want to do it. Okay. Extrinsic motivation is you do something because of what you can get from it, whether you can get money or whether or not you can get grades. So grades are extrinsic motivation. So what effect will getting rid of grades have on extrinsic motivation? It's going to go down. Good, Tucker. Okay. But does that necessarily mean it's going to negatively impact student behavior? No. So what would the effect of this have on student behavior in school?
So student behavior would be negatively affected because there's less motivation to do well.
Okay, so yeah, you could make that argument of getting rid of grades means that kids aren't going to do the work, that they're not going to study, they're not going to come to class, they don't have any consequences for not doing what they're supposed to do. You could also make a argument for positive. Okay, you could say that the decrease in extrinsic motivation would also decrease the pressure to make good grades, and they could learn for the sake of learning. Okay, both of those answers are correct as well as you word them correctly. So define and then apply. Christian said it would positively change. No, wait, you said it would negatively change student behavior because they wouldn't have an incentive to learn. Okay, you could also do the argument that it would positively change student behavior because they won't feel pressure from external forces to learn. Okay, what about arousal theory? Someone give me the definition for that. It has nothing to do with sex.
Is it like when people perform certain, I guess, actions to maintain a certain level of arousal?
Exactly right. And that's cognitive. Okay, it's the level of interest. Okay, so you want something that's challenging enough to be interesting, but not so challenging that you get tired and bored and you're like, this is too hard. I'm going to give up. I'll never do it. Okay, so how would that arousal theory apply to no more grades?
No more grades would decrease student productivity because there's less things to do now for students.
Yeah, they're not being challenged to do better. Okay, so if you take away grades, you could say, oh, then there's no consequences for their behavior, so they'll get bored because there's no way to measure if they're achieving their goals or not. So you could argue that under arousal theory, taking away grades would decrease their behavior relating to school. You could also make a counter argument of if the grades are too challenging, if a class is too hard, students aren't going to want to take it. Okay, but if you take away grades, then their arousal theory, okay, might work to positively change their behavior because they're more likely to take that class because it's a challenge and they're learning rather than, oh, my GPA might be at stake. Okay, so either argument could work there. Excellent. What's learned helplessness?
Isn't this when like someone is like continuously put in like a negative situation and then they just like don't like they stop trying to change the situation even like when they can?
Exactly right. Okay, like in abusive relationships. Okay, or if you're a rat in an electrified cage, eventually that rat is going to learn that you're going to get shocked no matter what. So it stops trying to escape. Okay, it's very depressing. So learned helplessness is exactly what Chandler said. You don't see a way out. You don't see a purpose in fighting, so you give up fighting. Now, how would that relate to grades?
Could it be like even if you take away the grades, the students would still feel like they have to continue working as if they were still being graded on it?
Well, how would grades relate to helplessness? Have y'all ever taken a class where you feel like no matter what you do, no matter how hard you study, you're never going to pass or you're never going to make the grade that your parents or you want you to make? Yeah, and so if you feel like there's no way, like let's say you calculated for midterms, you calculated what you needed to make an A for the semester and it was impossible. You need like 120. Well, are you going to try for an A? No. If you only need to make a 50 to keep a B, then you're like, okay, that's more reasonable. Okay, so in terms of grades, taking away grades could help curtail learned helplessness. Because if you have a student who is getting D's and F's on assignments, even though they're trying, that may discourage them from trying at all. Because what's the point in working so hard if you're not going to see a change in your grade? So by taking away grades, you can also take away that learned helplessness. They don't feel that pressure to perform. Now, the self-fulfilling prophecy, that's the idea that your mindset, okay, your locus of control matters in your actions and their effects. So like I'll have students who've come into my class, usually freshmen, they're like, oh, Ms. McNeely, I'm ready to fail this test. Okay, they come up with the expectation of I'm going to fail. Like if I went into a math class and I'm like, yeah, no, I'm gonna fail because it's math and I'm me. Okay, then that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I already have the expectation of failing. And so it's more likely that my behaviors are going to lead to that end result, as opposed to if you come in and say, I'm going to make an A on this test, then that could lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, because you're like, I'm going to study, I'm going to go to a tutoring, I'm going to do my homework ahead of time. Okay, so how would that relate to grades? If you take away grades, what happens to self-fulfilling prophecy? And is it good or bad for students?
Would self fulfilling prophecy decrease because there's less things to predict about?
Okay, so you could say that getting rid of grades would decrease self-fulfilling prophecy because they can't make a prophecy on something that's just not going to happen because it's not possible. Like you can't say, oh, I'm going to fail this test if there's no grade. Okay, so that could decrease self-fulfilling prophecy by getting rid of grades and positively change student behavior because they're not worried about, oh, this is outside of my control, I'm going to fail. Okay, they have to find some other thing to focus on instead of their grades. Does that make sense? So remember, with FRQs, you need to TAD, term, apply, and define. It's not just enough to tell me what extrinsic motivation is. You have to tell me what effect does taking away grades have on extrinsic motivation. Okay, so multiple sentences. All right. So in terms of social psychology, the sociocultural model, when it comes to adolescent sexuality, that is typically during the onset of puberty, when those sex hormones are coming into effect. But you also have the cultural norms affecting sexuality and activity. So it's not just a matter of, oh, hormones, they control everything that I do. Okay, you also have cultural understandings that restrict or approve behavior. Okay, so in this graph, it says, do you think it is or is not morally wrong for a couple to have a baby if they're not married? Now, at the time that this survey was taken, the percent answering that it's wrong to have a child out of wedlock in the United States was almost 50%. Compare that to Singapore, which is 70%. Compare that to Iceland, which is like 3%. There can be different cultural understandings that are leading to the answers on this survey. Okay, Iceland has better health care and maternity leave. Okay, so maybe that is playing into whether or not a couple should have a baby if they're married or not married. Okay, because they have a social network or a social system that could help and assist with that. In the United States, okay, if you look at cultural understandings where it's a primarily Protestant nation, okay, that could have a different effect on their cultural understanding or their cultural understanding of premarital sex, versus Singapore, okay, where it's considered more morally wrong to have a child out of wedlock. That could relate to their culture, it could relate to religion, it could relate to pop culture. Okay, now the issue with surveys, like we said before, is that when people self-report, there's no way to see if they're lying or not, or if they're just answering a certain kind of way, or if the question's framed in a confusing way. Like if you get this question, do you think it is or is not morally wrong? Okay, if you say yes, then that means it's wrong. If you say no, then that means it's right. Okay, so it's kind of like the test questions that you get. They're like, all of these are causes of the Reformation, except. And you're like, oh man, I missed the word except, so I answered the wrong way because I was trying to find the false answer and I accidentally gave the true answer. Okay, so framing could play a role in the answers to this question. Also, change over time in a culture. Okay, if this was given in 1900, okay, like right after the age of industrialization and prior to World War I, there's probably going to be more social stigma around premarital sex and children out of wedlock, versus in modern times, that stigma has decreased. Okay, so it used to be 3% of women reported having sex by age 18, versus in modern times, there's a much higher percentage of women disclosing that information about their sexual activities. In one survey, about half of all high school kids in the United States reported having sex. The rates tended to be higher in Western Europe and America, but lower in Arab and Asian countries. Okay, so cultural understandings about what is morally right or wrong, or religious sanctions on that kind of behavior. But again, you also have other influences on surveys. Like for instance, in Western Europe and America, there is a lot of pop culture and media on the internet, on the TV, cable, Netflix, that kind of heightens sex as something that's cool. Okay, and so that may be presented as, oh, everybody's doing it and you're not doing it, so you must be lame. Okay, but remember, people will lie in order to make themselves better. The social desirability bias. So if there's an understanding of, oh, doing this makes you cool, then people might be more likely to report doing that. Okay, but wow, teenagers lying about having sex? No one lies on the internet, right? Or with drug use, even. They may report higher levels of drug use than they actually engage in. Okay, so don't fall into this trap of, oh, everybody's doing it, so I have to as well, because not everybody's doing it. Okay, these numbers could be inflated due to that self-serving bias. Are we good so far? All right. Now, I cannot teach you about actual contraceptives, so here is a clip art, okay, for virtual learning. But the use of contraceptives does relate to socio and cultural models in psychology. Now, in some studies, only about 1/3 of sexually active male teenagers use protective measures like condoms. So to address the motivations behind that behavior, it could be due to ignorance. Okay, if you don't know how to access contraceptives, or you don't know how to properly use contraceptives, guilt around sex. If you're taught that having sex in certain situations or before marriage or anything like that is sinful or bad or dirty, okay, then they may be less likely to engage in behavior that could be protective in those actions. No communication. Okay, this doesn't mean just no communication from parents or teachers about the methods that are out there, but no communication between partners. Okay, there's a different expectation between men and women on who's responsible for attaining contraceptives. And that responsibility often in our patriarchal society falls on women. Okay, so women are responsible for, or in our society, it leans towards saying, oh, you need to get access to this contraceptive or that contraceptive, and it's your responsibility because you're the one who gets pregnant, as if there's only one person involved in that equation. Okay, even birth control that has been created for men, hormonal birth control or permanent but reversible methods, had too many side effects to become popularized. Side effects like bloating, nausea, mood swings, acne. So that stopped the male birth control studies, didn't stop the female birth control studies. All those symptoms, just par for the course. Alcohol use. Okay, alcohol depresses your frontal lobe's ability to make good decisions. Okay, and so a higher rate of alcohol use is correlated with unsafe sexual practices. Now, when it comes to alcohol use, legally, if you're under the influence of alcohol or any drug, you cannot give consent. If a person is intoxicated, if a person is unconscious, if a person is incarcerated, if a person is underage, they legally cannot give consent. Remember, no one's ever died from not having sex. If someone says no, you're going to be fine. You're not going to die. Okay, so when it comes to consent, you need enthusiastic, affirmative consent. Them actually verbalizing, saying yes. It might be awkward to stop and say, okay, I have this contract. Do you mind for legal purpose? Like, it may be awkward to have that conversation, but it's a lot better to have that conversation and make sure that everyone's on the same page and they're both having the same understanding of what's going on than to have the fallout of if that didn't take place. Okay, so even though we're talking about biological drives and drive reduction theory, okay, this is not something you need to live. You will be fine. We also have misinformation that's perpetrated by pop culture. Like if you've ever seen a romantic scene in a movie, which inevitably they always take place when you're in the middle of watching a movie with your parents, and it's like super awkward and you're just like, how long is this movie? They don't stop and have these conversations. They don't stop and, get contraceptives or protection. It's just like, no, it's taking too much time. We just going to get quick to the story. Okay, so that creates a false narrative of expectations for what it's supposed to be like. And so if you don't see that modeled in TV shows or movies or whatever media that you're consuming, then you're less likely to be aware of those contraceptive methods. Okay, now, do females face the same reasons for unprotected sex? Well, yes, there's ignorance about contraceptives, there's guilt, especially in a patriarchal society when it comes to female sexuality, lack of communication, issues with consent, okay, and also the fact that as a woman, they are the ones who have the capacity to carry that life to term. Or that zygote to term. And so a lot more stigma is associated with female sexuality. Are we good so far? Okay. So for our continuing lecture today, we last left off talking about sexuality and culture and how it relates to cultural psychology. And now we're going to move on to the construct of sexuality. Now, you may remember talking about Alfred Kinsey and his Kinsey reports, where he had a spectrum for where someone might land in terms of sexual orientation. But we're going to go through the definition of what that is, and also what are some factors behind it? What's some correlational data that we have tied to this subject? So, sexual orientation is a sexual attraction towards either members of your own gender, homosexual. So homo means same. So this means attraction to the same gender, or to the other gender, hetero. Hetero meaning different. So, and there's also a middle ground between that, again, with the Kinsey reports and new information as it comes out. There is a spectrum when it comes to sexual orientation and identification on that spectrum. How is this determined? Well, we don't have any evidence that sexuality is socially determined. So what this means is being raised by homosexual parents doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be homosexual. Okay, there's no more of a chance of that than if they were raised by heterosexual parents. Okay, since there's not a real nurture aspect to homosexuality, it's more likely that there's a nature aspect. It's more likely that sexuality is biologically determined rather than socially determined. Are we good so far? Okay, so what is some evidence for biological determination? Well, no worries, Gavin. Simon LeVay discovered that there was a cluster in the hypothalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of things. It controls our growth hormone through the, which gland is it now? It's not the pineal gland, I don't think. The pineal gland controls melatonin. And then it also controls whether we feel hungry or whether we feel full with the lateral hypothalamus and the ventral medial hypothalamus. Okay, it's also involved in memory and the limbic system. Well, now there's also evidence that it could be linked to biological factors in sexuality. This cluster of cells in the hypothalamus is found to be larger in people who are sexually attracted to men. Or sorry, it appears to be larger in people who are sexually attracted to women. Okay, so heterosexual men are attracted to women and their hypothalamus cluster is larger. Heterosexual women and homosexual men are both attracted to men. And so their cluster in their hypothalamus tends to be smaller. Now, what caused that hypothalamus to change size? Well, it's kind of like a nature versus nurture. We don't really know. It could be socially developed, just like your brain is a muscle, and the more you use it, the more you can do with it. Or it could be another biological factor, with most of the evidence leaning towards a biological factor, specifically hormones in uteri. Okay, so when you're in utero as a zygote forming into a child that's ready to be born to term, hormones can affect that development. So there is some evidence that hormones present in the uterus while you are cooking, essentially, can impact that cluster of cells in your hypothalamus. So again, if we're looking at nature versus nurture, we're seeing a lot more nature than we are seeing nurture. Does that make sense so far? All right. So what are some external stimuli or nurture aspects of sexuality? Well, the sexual response cycle, you may remember, has 4 stages, and those 4 stages are similar in both genders, with a difference being in the refractory period in terms of the length of that refractory period. But when it comes to the beginnings of that sexual response cycle, with the first stage being excitement, okay, external factors can include erotic material. That's not something that's only specific to men or to women. Okay, it's across the human spectrum. Okay, now, while material like this is an external stimuli, this could lead to the formation of behaviors or ideas about sexuality that influence someone beyond just that material. So some psychologists have argued that sexually explicit materials, now that can include pornography, it can include R-rated movies, it can include walking through the mall and you see the Victoria's Secret store with all its advertisements, okay? They can have negative effects, or even TikTok. Okay, I've seen this new challenge on TikTok, like the silhouette challenge. I mean, some of them are funny, where it's like they're like dressed like in sweatpants or whatever, and then they show up in like a hot dog suit. Okay, but other ones, it's just like, okay, I think that's what the kids call thirst traps, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be like pornography that falls under this category. but anything in pop culture or media could fall into being possibly sexually explicit. That's why whenever you watch a TV show, it may say MA or it may say rated R, and then it tells you why. There's cussing, or there's smoking, or there's violence, or there's sexual situations. Okay, it can cross a wide gamut of situations. So how could sexually explicit materials have negative effects on people? Men, women, children, adults.
I guess it could like set up unrealistic standards for how attractive someone's expected to be, because for like things like porn, like they don't use ugly people.
Let's say as a general rule, that's true. Unrealistic expectations. Okay, that is exactly right. There can be unrealistic expectations of what is desirable or what is undesirable. Okay, if you look at like a Victoria's Secret fashion show, okay, I'm not going to see my body type up there. Does that mean I'm ugly? No. Okay, I think I'm okay. I think I'm pretty cute, right? But it could have a negative effect on my self-esteem if that's portrayed as the ideal. Okay, or it could set up unrealistic expectations for men of what women should or could look like. Okay, so unrealistic expectations. We also know that under behaviorism, behavior can be modeled for us. Okay, this is social learning. Let's say that you're watching a bunch of romance movies like The Notebook or whatever, and then you try to use that as a basis for dating. Okay, like I'm going to send all these letters to my crush and they're going to think it's so cute, and then they end up getting a restraining order against you. Okay, so unrealistic expectations of what relationships should be like, of what dating should be like, or of what sexuality could be like. So that modeling behavior can have negative effects. Okay, just like with abusive relationships, if that behavior is modeled by a parent or parents, okay, then the child uses that social learning as a blueprint for what they are supposed to be as a man or as a woman when they grow up. Okay, so it can set some behaviors for that child growing up. Also, sexually explicit material creates superficial sexual knowledge. If all you know about sexuality is what you see from Seth Rogen movies, then you're probably going to have some pretty weird ideas about what's normal or what's not normal. If you're watching movies and it's about teenagers in high school and they're all having sex and doing drugs, right? You might think, wait, is that what it's supposed to be like? Because it's not at all. Okay, so unrealistic expectations and the illusion of knowing what you're talking about. I mean, y'all have been to middle school. There are people who are like, oh yeah, this is what this is. And it's just like, no, I don't think that's how that works. Also, you have the normalization of problematic behavior. Okay, this material could give misogynist views a platform. It could portray some behavior as normal or as normative when it's not, or it is problematic. Okay, so it could lead to issues with harassment or with self-esteem issues of, well, is that what sexuality is supposed to be like versus not what sexuality is supposed to be like. Okay, so all of these are effects based on external stimuli. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns? All right. And so when it comes to sexual motivation. Different cultures, different regions, different countries, they're all going to have different ideas about what is taboo and what is acceptable. Although there are some across the board taboos when it comes to sexuality in particular. So incest, okay, across all cultures is typically seen as taboo. Now, the degree of that can be different. I mean, in Egypt, brothers married sisters. The European monarchies, Charles II of the Habsburg dynasty was the child of his uncle, and his mom was the niece, but they were so close genetically that they could have been brother and sister. In Alabama, you can marry your first cousin. Okay, so there's like variation. Yeah, that's legal. You could also get married at 14 in Alabama. Yeah, that's still legal. Yeah, child marriage is still legal in the United States, y'all. You have to have parental consent. But yeah, that's a whole nother. So it's like when you look at like other countries and you're like, oh, how can they be like that? And then it's like, let's take a look at ourselves real quick and see what's going on there. Okay, so incest is typically taboo. Other things outside of sexuality include cannibalism is typically taboo in all cultures, but you do see some differentiation based on the culture or the climate or the background. Okay, so some of these discussion questions, the answers to them may differ based on how you were raised, where you were raised, and your parents' personal beliefs on that or your personal beliefs on that. So should sex education focus on abstinence only? Well, Alabama is an abstinence only state, and so that's legally the curriculum that we have to cover. Okay, typically in the southern United States, you're going to see more focus on abstinence only education. Whereas in northern states or European countries, you might see safe sex practices being discussed as a part of that educational platform. Okay, should some sexual acts be labeled as perversions? Well, it depends on the culture, and it also depends on the time period. Okay, for instance, homosexuality used to be criminalized. If y'all have ever seen, I think it's called The Turing Effect or Enigma, Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing. Okay, now Alan Turing was an influential code breaker for the Allies during World War II, but he was gay. And being gay in Britain was criminal. So he was arrested and put in prison and then chemically castrated for the crime, quote unquote, of being gay. Now, is that how things are run today? No. Okay. Also, miscegenation. Okay. Loving versus Virginia. Okay. That was the first Supreme Court case where a mixed race couple, an African-American woman and a white man, were imprisoned. They were jailed for being in a relationship because miscegenation or different races dating amongst each other was illegal. That wasn't that long ago, y'all. I think actually miscegenation may still be on the books in Alabama, but don't quote me on that. Look that up. Okay, or maybe, I think it was like 2001, maybe it was taken out of the Constitution, but I'd have to look into it again. Okay, so should some sexual acts be labeled as perversions? Well, the definition of that is going to differ based on culture, time period, context. Okay, and so as a general rule, I would think if I were trying to define what would or wouldn't fall under that, would be, is it consensual? Is it between two human adults? Okay, so they got to be human, they got to be adult, it's got to be consensual, they got to be capable of giving consent. So that excludes children, animals, people who are imprisoned, people in imbalances of power in their relationship, like boss versus employee. Okay, so you have to fill a lot of degrees there in terms of how do you make that box to make those boundaries. Does formal sex education lead to an increase in premarital sex? Okay, well, some people argue that that's why abstinence only is the education platform to use. There are fears, there are comments that if you teach something other than abstinence only, then it would encourage teenagers to push abstinence to the side and engage in other behaviors. Now, that's trying to assume causation from correlation. Okay, we know that causation is not correlation and correlation is not causation. So there could be other factors that play a role in that. Should third graders read Johnny and His Two Mothers? Okay, well, on one side of the argument, you have people arguing that at age 9, third grade elementary school, that might be too young to be exposed to those sorts of questions. Anything dealing with sexuality might be taboo with discussing with children. On the other hand, most of our media is representative of heterosexual behaviors. If you read a book, there's usually a mom and a dad, or if you watch a TV show, there's a mom and a dad kissing, or there's a girl and a guy holding hands. Okay, so it's on in terms of representativeness or representation. Okay, if heterosexuality is so easily ingrained in all of our media, why is homosexuality as a form of media somehow taboo? And again, it depends on the culture and the laws and the climate and the context of where these questions are being asked. Are we good so far? But the point of that is that you have to take into consideration cultural and social aspects of psychology. It's not just going to be purely biological or evolutionary. Okay, now in terms of genetics with homosexuality, there have been some case studies that have found that if one identical twin, and identical twins are the same in terms of DNA, born at the same time, same egg, same sperm, okay, so same chromosomes. If one identical twin is homosexual, then the other twin has about a 50% chance of also being homosexual. What's interesting is that between fraternal twins who often have or share the same uterus but have different eggs that they form from, that percentage drops to about 20%. So what does this tell us? What does that shift in percentages tell us about homosexuality? If we're talking about nature versus nurture, according to this, what has a bigger role? More so nature. Okay, we have biological reasons or evidence discussing how homosexuality develops. Now, what's the root of this? What can lead to that? Well, the prenatal environment appears to have a lot of influence on development that occurs later in adult life. Okay, so current research with sheep has found that if you increase hormonal levels in the uterus, if you increase hormones during a pregnancy, that those hormones can influence the development of sexuality during puberty. And so from this, they were able to create homosexual sheep. Okay, now, can they perform this experiment with humans to test it further? No. What are some ethical issues here with human trials doing this?
Humans are more complex, so they may have different effects on us.
Exactly right. We are not animals. Okay, so there could be some other side effects. What about the risk? Okay, the risk to a fetus by elevating hormone levels probably wouldn't outweigh the benefits. Are they doing this research to cure disease? Are they searching for the cure to cancer? No. So fundamentally changing someone's key identity, okay, artificially could have excessive negative effects that don't outweigh, or that do outweigh, any benefits that this study could bring about, okay? And it's very, very rare that you'll ever find experimentation involving humans, especially unborn children, because can they understand the risks? Can they sign a waiver? No, they cannot consent to this sort of study. So this is probably going to stay more limited to the animal world as opposed to implementing it in humans. Okay, so hormones play a role in the determination of sexuality. Okay, so if we're looking at nature versus nurture, more so, we're going to see more arguments supporting the nature argument. Okay, homosexuality is not a result of parenting. Okay, being parented by gay or straight parents isn't more or less likely to make you gay or straight. Homosexuality is not a result of hatred of the opposite gender. It's not the result of hormones currently in the bloodstream. Okay, those hormones have to have been exposed in uteri. And it's also not a result of molestation. Okay, so some common myths about homosexuality. Okay, however, exposure to hormones, especially experienced by female fetuses during the pregnancy between the 2nd and 5th month, so approximately the 2nd trimester, does play a role in homosexuality. Genetic ties, according to twin studies, there is a nature element. Back to those percentages of 50 to 20%. There are biological differences in the brain between heterosexual males and homosexual males, particularly that cell cluster in the hypothalamus. 3 to 4% of the population, possibly higher than that, does identify as homosexuality. The median age or the average age for recognizing homosexuality is around 20 years old, although this could be delayed due to a need for financial independence before risking coming out. So it might actually be recognized much younger in adolescence. Okay, but social factors like ostracization, homophobic jokes, doubt, or guilt, depending on their situation, could delay that recognition or identification to a later age. Does that make sense so far? All right, does anyone need this slide? All right. So we're done with sexual motivation. Now we're just going to move on to regular motivation. We're done. All right, so the belongingness motivation. Now these motivations are going to be outside of the biological drives. It's not really going to adhere to drive reduction theory because remember, drive reduction theory has to deal with survival. You're thirsty, you're hungry, okay? And so that drives you towards a behavior. These motivations are going to be more in the humanistic wheelhouse. Okay, remember that hierarchy of needs where near the top of the pyramid, you reach self-actualization. At the bottom is your basic survival. Okay, water, food, shelter. Then you move higher up and you start forming self-esteem and family and friend ties. So the belongingness motivation stems from a need for affiliation. So this is a social motivation. This is the idea that humans are social creatures. Okay, we don't hang out by ourselves. We like to form groups. Now, what motivates us to form those groups? Well, if you're thinking of evolutionary benefit, being in a group helps survival. It's a lot harder for a lion to take you out if you're surrounded by a bunch of other cavemen. Okay, so it helps survival by forming those relationships. If you break your leg and you can't hunt, well, if you're by yourself, you would die to death. Okay, but if you have a community around you who can feed you and give you water until your leg heals, then you have a better chance of survival. So the affiliation need helps with survival. It also creates relationships that are evolutionarily beneficial because they are able to pass genes on to the future through those relationships, through those family ties, and that survival methodology. Also, social ties feel good. Okay, this affiliation need, okay, results in increased levels of serotonin, which is associated with mood and the decrease in depression. And it's also associated with decreasing the amounts of pain that you feel. Okay, so it feels good, helps you live, and you can pass on your genes. All very strong arguments for why we have an affiliation need. Are we good so far? All right. Achievement motivation. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's the desire to do stuff, okay, at a high level. It's having high expectations for yourself. You want to achieve. And successful people, motivated people, often set challenging but attainable goals. So you want it to be challenging enough to keep your attention, but not so challenging that you get bored and give up. So this deals with the arousal theory, Yerkes-Dodson's law, where if you have too much of a challenge, you lose motivation because it's too hard. If you have too little of a challenge, then you lose motivation because it's too easy. Instead, you want to be right here, okay, where your performance is high and your arousal is high. So you're focused on what you're doing and you're doing it well, okay? So when you want to set challenging but attainable goals, if I set a goal for myself to pass the AP physics exam, that's definitely challenging, right? But is that attainable for me? Absolutely not. I would just write like the entire intro to Star Wars on my paper. Like, it's not happening. I slept through most of physics. I'm not even going to lie. Okay, that would be very challenging but unattainable. If I said I'm going to make a 6 on the AP Psych exam, that's impossible. The highest it goes is 5. Okay, if I say I want to make a 3 on the AP Psych exam, that's attainable for me, definitely. But is that challenging? No. I could probably like guess on half the multiple choice, at this point, because I can write FRQs. Okay, that would not be challenging enough. So that doesn't meet my achievement motivation. I want to do something that is challenging, but it's possible. Like, oh, I'm going to try to make a 4 on the AP US history exam. Okay, maybe for math and science, not my thing. I'm not going to aim that high. I'm going to be more reasonable and lower the standards. Okay, so the goals that you set can either be performance goals or they can be learning goals. Okay, performance goals are extrinsic. You do them because of what you can get from doing them. For instance, if you take a bunch of AP classes and tests so that you can have a bunch of cords on graduation, so you're like decked out, like so many cords that your neck hurts from carrying them, that's performance goals. That's extrinsic reward. Okay, you want to take the tests and pass the tests so that you can get a cord, or you can be in a National Honor Society, or you can wear a fancy stole, or you can be valedictorian. Okay, learning goals are intrinsic. Okay, that would be if you decide to take an AP class because you're interested in the content, and you're going to take the test because you feel confident that you can do it and you can get the credit. Okay, so like if you signed up for AP Psych rather than AP Environmental Science, is because you're intrinsically motivated towards this class, as opposed to AP Psych was the only thing left on your choice form because all other 4 choices you had already got filled. That would be extrinsic. Okay, so performance is extrinsic, learning is intrinsic. Which one do you think is stronger as a motivation? Which one's stronger, intrinsic or extrinsic? Correct, intrinsic. Okay, that motivation lasts longer. Now, David McClelland is the psychologist associated with this idea of achievement motivation. Through his experiments with the Bonzo box, he found that people with a high need for achievement choose the moderate tasks. So not too easy, not too hard, just right in the middle. Think Goldilocks, right? And I'll have this video of McClelland's theory of needs posted in the Schoology page. Does anyone need this slide? Okay, so if you were to identify where a person with high achievement motivation would try to take their shot on the basketball court, where would they stand? At point A, point B, point C, or point D? And remember that high achievement motivation means they want something that's moderately difficult, something challenging but attainable. So tell me in the chat, is A, B, C, or D moderately difficult? Yes, Nathan. Okay, good. Most of y'all are putting C. A is too easy. Okay, even I could make a basket. Is that what you call it? Even I could shoot a hoop from right underneath. I'm trying, guys. From right underneath the basket or the rim, sports ball. Okay. B. Okay, I could probably make that shot too. All I gotta do is hit the backboard and get it into the basket thingy. Okay. D, way too hard. A half court shot, I'm not gonna make it. It's just not gonna happen. But C, maybe with practice, okay, and over time, I can learn how to make shots from here, 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 and here. Is this the free throw line? Some of y'all basketball people know better than I would. No, is this the free throw line? Okay, I'm following Nathan's nods. Okay, so A would be too easy, D would be too hard. Okay, C would be moderately difficult. Okay, something that you would actually see as a challenge. Does that make sense? All right. So there are two types of motivation. You should already be familiar with the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Remember that intrinsic means you're doing it because you want to do it. It's driven by a personal interest in the activity. Extrinsic is performing it because you want to get something out of it, or performing it so you don't get in trouble for not doing it. So getting rewards or avoiding punishments. Okay, so doing your homework, probably extrinsically motivated. You don't want to zero in I now. You don't want late points, unless it's an assignment you're really excited about doing. Like maybe it's a video paper essay that you have to watch a TV show and talk about clinical psychology as it relates to the show. Okay, that might be more entertaining to you, so you're more likely to do it. And like we said before, intrinsic is stronger than extrinsic because it's internal motivation. Okay, now when it comes to these motivations in terms of cultures, we see two different societies. We live in a society that adhere to intrinsic versus extrinsic goals. So collectivistic societies are typically found in the Eastern Hemisphere, and they prioritize the needs of the group over the needs of the individual. Okay? Individualistic societies are more common in the Western Hemisphere, and they prioritize the individual over the group. So examples of this, the COVID pandemic. In the East, you see high rates of mask wearing. Okay, the group comes together to protect individual members of the society from the pandemic. Okay, it's collectivistic. That's the cultural understanding of you need to put others before yourself. Versus in individualistic societies like Europe or the United States, there is a lot more resistance to mask wearing. There's a lot more resistance to lockdowns, okay, because it was claimed it was an infringement of individual liberties or personal liberties. So the liberties of the individual are more important than the well-being of the group. Okay, now that's not an individual understanding of each person in those countries or in those cultures. That's just a cultural zeitgeist or a general trend that we see. Okay, so collectivistic societies versus individualistic societies. Who do they prioritize, the group or the individual? And that can bring some insight into cultural behaviors in those countries. Are we good so far? Okay. We've talked about the over-justification effect previously with the pizza party and reading scores. If you love reading, but then you start getting rewarded with pizza, then what's going to happen to your love of reading? It's going to decrease because you get over-justified. You are excessively rewarded with a prize for something that you intrinsically already loved doing. So that decreased your intrinsic desire to do it. Okay, real life example. Who is this very famous football player? Yes, Nathan, Colin Kaepernick. Okay, Back in the day, he signed a 6-year, $114 million contract with the 49ers. Okay, is he a good football player? Yes. Does he love football? Yes. He got paid a lot of money because of his football abilities, sports, okay, but didn't get to play much. So he's still getting all of this money, the extrinsic reward for being a football player, but he doesn't get to actually play football. Okay, so what do you think that happened to his intrinsic love of football? Probably decreased because it was over justified. He doesn't get to play it. Okay, and then of course you have the other retaliations that were made against him during his career with the 49ers. But you see how this over justification effect can play a role, okay, in your intrinsic desires. Although if you could pay me $114 million to not exercise, I would take that so fast. All right, this is just an example of extrinsic versus intrinsic. Getting $5 for every A, you only study as long as you get paid, versus praise from your parents and you just love doing well. That's intrinsic. We're running out of time, so I'm going to really quick type in the last part of our lecture before we end today. We're going to talk about conflict. There are 4 types of conflict in this unit. You have the approach. You have the avoidance. You have the approach avoidance. And you have the multiple approach avoidance. Okay, so the first one, approach. This is when you have to choose between 2 desirable options. Let's say you're at the ice cream store and you get a free ice cream, but you have to choose between Rocky Road and, I don't know, mint chocolate chip. Well, if you love both of those, okay, you only get to choose one of the 2. So that's approach. No matter which ice cream you pick, you still have ice cream and you're happy. But you have to choose between your 2 favorite flavors. And so that's a conflict because you can't have both. Avoidance is when you have to choose between 2 undesirable options. Like, let's say you get to history class and they say you can either write an LEQ or a DBQ today. Well, do you want to write an essay at all? No. Okay, but you have to write one. So you're in conflict of, I can't avoid either of these essays. I need to pick which one I'm going to do, the LEQ or the DBQ. Okay. Approach avoidance is when you have a goal, but that goal has both attractive and unattractive features. For instance, if you are deciding whether or not you want to go to Auburn, well, some attractive features, they gave you a full ride. Unattractive features, you have to live on campus the entire time you're at school. Attractive features, all your friends are going there. Unattractive features, so is your ex. Okay, so it's a approach avoidance because it's like, okay, there's some good things and some bad things with this one choice. The last one is multiple approach avoidance. This is when there's a multitude of positive and negative choices between 2 choices. Let's say you're going to prom and you're going with your bae, right? Y'all have been dating for a while. You've known for a while you're going to go to prom together. You've already got the limo planned and all of that. Well, then all of a sudden Beyonce DMs you and says, hey, I hear you're going to prom. Can I be your date? Well, now you have 2 choices. And there are positives and negatives to both of those choices. You could go to prom with your boo, all right, and have a really good time, but you miss out on going to prom with Beyonce. Okay, which everyone would be like, what are you doing? Then, if you choose to go with Beyonce, however, your boo might feel a certain kind of way. They might be like, seriously, you choose Beyonce? Well, actually, no, that's fair. Okay, but seriously? So you have 2 negatives and 2 positives. Can't have both. So it's multiple approach avoidance. You have to decide what your decision is, and there's going to be pros and cons on both sides. Honestly, if Beyonce wanted to take me to prom, I'd be like, forget everybody else. This is my life now. This is who I am.